At 2:07 a.m., while the building slept and the servers breathed through my monitors, I opened the bonus email that finally stripped the illusion off my job. The subject line said "Recognition Update," cheerful and clean. My coworker's name appeared first, praised for leadership impact, followed by a $30,000 figure that sat there confidently. My name came last. Continued support, it said, paired with $4,000, like an afterthought someone hoped I wouldn't read twice. I didn't react right away. I felt it instead, a brief tightening in my chest that caught me off guard. My fingers hovered over the mouse stiff, as if my body had processed the insult before my mind allowed it. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay composed. Still, one thought slipped through before I pushed it down. They finally put a price on me, and it was smaller than I expected. I'd been here longer than most of them. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I work the hours no one wanted tied to their reputation. Nights, weekends, holidays, silent emergencies that never made it into reports. When something broke at 2 a.m., they didn't call my coworker, they called me. When leadership needed a miracle by morning, it wasn't leadership that stayed awake. Seeing the numbers side by side didn't feel shocking. It felt clarifying. The humiliation came later, disguised as philosophy. In the morning meeting, my manager smiled and said, "This just shows how much we value impact over effort." My coworker leaned back and added, "Visibility really matters in this company." A few people nodded. No one looked at me. I muted my mic and stared at the dashboard I'd built, the one they trusted more than any presentation, and wondered when effort had become something to apologize for. By lunchtime, congratulations flooded the group chat. Emojis, inside jokes, public praise stacked neatly under his name. Someone wrote, "Couldn't have happened to a better leader." I typed nothing. I remembered every risk I'd escalated and been told, "Let's not overcomplicate this," only to be called later when the same issue nearly tore through production. Each memory lined up cleanly with that $4,000, a number small enough to dismiss, large enough to sting. That night the pressure returned like it always did, quiet and assumed. Alerts began to flicker, minor at first, then clustering in patterns I recognized immediately. I messaged my manager with a short update. He replied, "You've got it right." It wasn't a question. I typed monitoring, knowing that monitoring was code for intervention, and intervention was expected, unpaid, and invisible. At around 1:40 a.m., the system strained harder. Latency spiked across components most people didn't even know existed. This wasn't a fire yet, but it was close enough that my pulse adjusted automatically. My coworker was asleep. Leadership was confident. They trusted that I'd absorb it like always. As I watched the metrics wobble, a thought surfaced that I didn't invite and couldn't ignore. What happens if I don't? At exactly 2 a.m., an automated escalation request appeared, asking for acknowledgement. The language was familiar, neutral, almost comforting. I hovered over the keyboard, hearing my manager's voice from earlier, impact over effort. I felt that same tightness in my chest again, sharper this time. Then something settled. I realized this wasn't a pause or a test. If I stood up now, I wouldn't undo it later. I closed the laptop, logged my shift end, and stood. The decision felt heavier than anger, heavier than relief. It felt final. I walked past the server racks humming steadily, unaware of how much they depended on routines no one documented. As the door shut behind me, my phone stayed silent. No override, no last-minute call. I didn't know exactly what would break by morning, only that the system was about to experience itself without my compensation. The drive home felt unreal, like I'd stepped out of a role without permission. For years, I'd been the invisible margin between stability and collapse. Now that margin was gone. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exposed, uncertain, and strangely calm. Whatever happened next wouldn't be mine to fix quietly. And for the first time since I'd opened that email, I understood that my silence had been part of the architecture all along. By morning, the absence made noise before any alarm did. I woke up to no missed calls, no frantic voicemails, which was unusual after a night like that. When I checked internal channels, they were quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like people were speaking elsewhere on purpose. Then a message appeared, forwarded accidentally by a junior analyst. "Status unclear. Who's on point?" My name wasn't included. That omission landed harder than if it had been. At the office, the atmosphere felt compressed. Conversation stayed low and clipped, eyes flicking to dashboards and then away. My coworker arrived late, relaxed, carrying his coffee like a trophy. He joked, "Big week, huh?" Guest leadership finally noticed and glanced at me as if expecting agreement. I nodded once, neutral. An hour later, a director stopped by my desk and asked casually, "Did you log off early last night?" I answered, at shift end, and watched his smile pause just long enough to register concern. Pressure followed quickly, dressed up as collaboration. A calendar invite appeared titled Process Alignment, pulling me into a room with two managers who spoke carefully about team balance and shared responsibility. One of them said, "We really rely on your commitment, Daniel," stressing rely like it was praise. I replied evenly, "I work within defined roles." The room cooled. They hadn't expected the dependents to be named without apology. After that meeting, my isolation became visible. Tasks I'd always been looped into skipped my inbox entirely, then came back broken. When I didn't fix them immediately, Slack threads stretched longer, questions piling up without answers. Someone finally messaged, "Do you have a minute?" I responded an hour later with a single line. The delay wasn't strategic. It was structural. For the first time, I was operating exactly as scoped, and the system didn't like it. Rumors filled the gaps where clarity should have been. I passed a conference room and heard, "It's bigger than expected," followed by, "How did we miss this?" The word audit surfaced twice, then stopped being said aloud. My coworker brushed it off loudly, telling people, "These systems are resilient," smiling as if confidence itself were a fix. No one challenged him, but no one echoed him either. Resilience is comforting until it's measured. The social distance widened fast. Lunch invitations stopped, replaced by polite nods. A senior engineer pulled me aside and said quietly, "They're checking access logs," then added, "Off the record, be careful." I thanked him without asking questions. Fear rearranges hierarchy quickly. People who had ignored my presence now avoided my eyes, unsure whether I was irrelevant or dangerous. That uncertainty followed me through the hallways like static. Late in the afternoon, an email arrived marked confidential. It wasn't addressed to me, but it referenced components I'd architected years earlier, using language that leaned legal without committing. It asked for clarification on historical dependencies. I forwarded it to my manager with a single line, "See below." He didn't reply. Instead, his assistant asked if I'd be available later, just in case. That phrase said more than any apology could have. By then, my coworker's confidence had shifted into irritation. He paced during calls, filling silence with reassurance no one requested. At one point he laughed and said, "We've handled worse," but his eyes kept checking his phone. Leadership still projected calm, but the calm felt practiced, rehearsed too late. I watched them work harder to maintain narrative than to understand structure, and the gap between those efforts kept widening. As the day ended, my phone vibrated with a message from an internal number I didn't recognize. "Were you aware of the legacy override?" it asked. I stared at it longer than necessary. That phrase wasn't common knowledge. It meant someone had started looking in the right place. I didn't respond. I packed my bag and left on time, aware that something foundational had been exposed, and that whatever they were about to uncover wouldn't be resolved by reassurance, visibility, or another bonus explanation. The truth didn't surface as an accusation or a meeting. It surfaced as a request. A compliance analyst emailed asking for a walkthrough of a legacy module no one had referenced in years, one I designed quietly after an incident leadership preferred to forget. During the call, she paused mid-sentence and said, "This dependency isn't documented anywhere." I replied, "It wasn't meant to be visible," and let the silence sit. That silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was diagnostic. What they were circling wasn't a bug or an oversight. It was a structural reliance built to survive moments no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. Years earlier, after a near collapse that almost triggered external reporting, I'd been told, "Just stabilize it, we'll clean it up later." Later never came. The reliance stayed, nested deep, triggered only under pressure. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And it worked because I was always there to activate it quietly. The bonus disparity began to make sense backward. Visibility was rewarded because it was measurable. My contribution was. I operated in the space between failure and disclosure where success looks like nothing happened. When I stepped away at 2 a.m., I didn't break anything. I simply removed the human buffer that had been masking risk for years. The analyst asked, "Is the override still active?" I answered, "Only during escalation." She said, "Then escalation explains the instability, like a conclusion settling into place." Leadership still felt safe then. In meetings, they framed the issue as unexpected behavior and praised my coworker's composure. He said, "Good thing we have redundancy," smiling easily, performing confidence without comprehension. No one corrected him. Redundancy only exists when it's designed. What they had was assumption reinforced by habit. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it was measurable, and measurement has a way of stripping tone from the conversation. I was invited to fewer discussions than to one that mattered. Legal joined quietly, cameras off, listening more than speaking. Someone asked, "If we had to document this dependency retroactively, how far back would that go?" I said, "To the incident that prompted it," and added, "which wasn't disclosed externally." The room went still. No one asked follow-ups. Some truths don't need elaboration to change posture. My coworker felt it before he understood it. He stopped joking and started hovering, filling silence with summaries that missed the point. Near the elevators, he finally said, "You could have mentioned this earlier, like we shared responsibility." I looked at him and said, "I did," keeping my voice flat. "Years ago." He scoffed, "That's convenient," but his eyes dropped. Convenience is what people call memory when it becomes evidence. The real turning point arrived without ceremony. An access request hit my inbox restoring privileges that had been quietly restricted months earlier. No explanation, just a note. For continuity. Continuity was their word for dependence they didn't want to name. I approved the access and changed nothing. Action wasn't required anymore. The system had already revealed itself, and institutions respond to exposure more reliably than individuals ever do. By the end of the week, uncertainty gave way to clarity. I understood why my silence had been rewarded until it wasn't, why my absence caused disproportionate strain, and why no one wanted to acknowledge it directly. I hadn't been undervalued by mistake. I'd been undervalued because accuracy was inconvenient. Knowing that didn't make me angry. It made me certain. The power shift wasn't coming. It had already occurred quietly, the moment reality became more expensive to ignore than truth. The reversal didn't arrive with blame or raised voices. It arrived through process. Audit requests multiplied, precise and unemotional, asking for timelines, ownership trails, and risk acknowledgement. Leadership started attending calls they used to delegate, listening instead of directing. Every question circled the same absence without naming it. The system stabilized slowly, not because someone fixed it heroically, but because controls were rewritten around dependencies they could no longer pretend didn't exist. My coworker sensed the shift before anyone explained it. His calendar filled with clarification sinks, meetings with no outcomes and too many observers. In one review, he tried to summarize an issue and leaned on language I'd written years earlier. A director interrupted gently, "Daniel, can you confirm?" All eyes turned to me. I clarified in 2 sentences, neutral and exact, and watched him sit back, realizing confidence doesn't substitute for understanding when scrutiny replaces applause. Legal consequences followed quietly, dressed as diligence. External auditors asked for documentation that didn't exist, then asked why. Timelines exposed how often interventions had happened outside formal reporting, my name appearing repeatedly in logs no one had wanted to analyze. Each entry reframed the bonus decision retroactively, not as unfair but as negligent. Leadership stopped defending it once they understood what defense would require them to admit. Pressure moved upward where it belonged. Managers who once spoke about impact over effort now spoke about risk concentration and single points of failure. Language changed because the audience had changed. My coworker was reassigned to a visibility-heavy role with no authority, framed as growth but stripped of influence. He tried to joke, saying, "At least I'm not on call anymore," but relief sounds different when it isn't chosen. I stayed still throughout, responding only when asked. Systems don't need commentary, just accurate inputs. When an executive finally asked, "Why wasn't this escalated sooner?" I said, "It was," and listed dates without emphasis. No argument followed, only faster note-taking. Silence did more damage than confrontation ever could. Every unanswered question pointed back to decisions made in comfort, not crisis. The financial correction arrived last, almost apologetic in its neutrality. Budgets were adjusted under revised performance frameworks, bonuses reassessed without explanation. My coworker's $30,000 became an unspoken liability no one referenced again. My own compensation was corrected upward, folded into base and retention structures that didn't require gratitude. The imbalance corrected itself without ceremony, which felt appropriate. This wasn't about emotion. It was about accuracy. By the time leadership understood the full scope, the outcome was irreversible. Reports had been filed, controls documented, responsibility redistributed. No single person was blamed, which meant everyone involved lost something quieter but deeper: certainty. They'd assumed silence meant consent, that endurance meant agreement. The system corrected that misunderstanding efficiently, without asking how anyone felt about it. Nothing dramatic marked the end. No meeting closed with lessons learned. No email announced transformation. The absence of spectacle was the point. The system now operated within truth instead of assumption, and my role was finally aligned with reality. I left the building one evening without checking alerts, confident they would ring for someone else. Not out of resentment, but because balance had been restored and my silence was no longer required to hold everything together. The final acknowledgement arrived quietly, folded into routine updates that no one announced. A revised org chart circulated without commentary, my role repositioned above operational noise, advisory and insulated. Access followed immediately. Systems I once patched at night now reported to dashboards I reviewed in daylight. The absence of ceremony mattered. It signaled that the correction wasn't a reward, just a return to accuracy, as if the organization quietly recognized what had always been true. My coworker avoided me after that. When we crossed paths near the elevators, he forced a smile and said, "Guess things worked out," as if luck had intervened. I replied, "Systems tend to," and walked past. He didn't follow. His reassignment became permanent, his visibility redirected into presentations that no longer influenced outcomes. People still nodded at his confidence, but no one waited for it. Authority had shifted silently, measured by understanding rather than posture. Leadership's tone changed subtly. Requests became questions, deadlines came with context. One executive said during a review, "We should have listened sooner," then corrected himself. "We should have measured better." That distinction mattered. Measuring better doesn't require apology, it requires adjustment. I accepted that. I didn't need them to admit humiliation or oversight. I needed the system to stop demanding sacrifice it refused to recognize. That correction held, and it was enough. The bonus discrepancy was never revisited directly. Accounting folded adjustments into long-term retention structures, smoothing numbers without naming cause. Stability, not celebration, became the reward. Sleep returned. Weekends became actual time, not deferred responsibility. Alerts still existed, but they rang for teams now documented and staffed correctly. I watched the system operate without me and felt relief, not pride. The work mattered again because it existed independently of recognition. People occasionally asked why I didn't push harder, why I didn't demand fairness when the email arrived. I told them, demanding assumes the listener values accuracy. Some nodded. Others didn't. That was fine. The lesson wasn't for everyone. It was for systems that rely on unseen labor and assume it will always be there. Absence teaches faster than argument, and consequences speak louder than complaints ever could. I didn't leave with triumph or resentment. I left with equilibrium. The system corrected itself because it had to, not because I forced it. My dignity returned not through victory but through alignment, when effort and responsibility finally matched authority. That balance held, and it continues to hold because it's built on truth rather than visibility. And in environments driven by illusion, truth doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs time. When effort becomes invisible by design, withdrawal isn't rebellion. It's alignment with reality. Everything else, the frustration, the disparity, the small humiliations, fades into context. What remains is clarity. What remains is authority measured not by appearances but by understanding. And for Daniel Mercer, that quiet recalibration was the only justice worth having.